They use their media to assassinate the truth, to tell you that you don't know what's really going on. They use their TV shows and their movie stars and their singers to repeat their narrative over and over again, all to convince you that the bugs that live inside your brain aren't real, even though you know they're real because you're an American. And Americans have always had colonies of bugs chewing through their brain tissue. And then they use their ex-president to send messages directly into your mind through the microwave in the break room at work, telling you to text obscene photos to your ex-wife's sister. Sorry, Tammy, that wasn't me. It was Obama. And getting me to send those dick pics was just another part of his twisted Muslim agenda. But you're better than Obama, because you're an American. And you know that the bugs that live inside your brain are healthy and good, because they were placed there by the founding fathers. Sometimes, if you're quiet enough, you can hear the bugs singing the national anthem. And the bugs show respect for the anthem, unlike black people from Africa. Did you know that black people invented AIDS? I did, because the bugs told me. And then they use their social workers and school psychologists and doctors to tell you that you're crazy and that you shouldn't be around children, that you're a danger to yourself and others, until the only option left is for you to do what Americans have always done, to go stand outside your ex-wife's house in a clown suit until the neighbors call the police. And when that happens, they'll get their Jew lawyers to file a restraining order, and you'll be forced to do what any patriot would do. Start a YouTube channel that tells the masses the truth about the bugs that live inside your brain. You can find it at youtube.com/brainbugs or follow my Instagram. I'm the National Brain-Eating Parasite Association, and I'm freedom's safest place.
Multi-armed deities.
Twisted and gyrated in provocative and sensual fashion.
There is no future.
So why not just burn the whole fucking thing down?
People are so evil.
I wish I could find a Hitler of today and go kill him.
What a time to be alive.
Welcome to the Nostalgia Trap AM/FM. This episode features a conversation about a recent epidemic of mass violence in America. If by recent you mean the entire length of American history. Our two hosts attempt to create a political and economic framework through which we can understand American violence, and recognize that things like the Trail of Tears, Oklahoma City, Columbine, and the Pulse nightclub shooting, are all part of the same historical continuum. To put it simply, America is a demonic engine of hatred that feeds on the blood and flesh of a tormented humanity. This episode is brought to you by the blood of the innocent. Over 8 billion served. Please enjoy.
Let's get started. I mean, the last time you and I spoke, at least in the context of recording our conversations, we were speaking about a lot about the opioid crisis in America, a lot about drugs and the intersection of the drug crisis with the larger politics and larger economics of where the country's at right now. And we introduced this topic and this word. I don't know if our listeners necessarily know about this concept of necropolitics, but do you want to give do you want to take a shot at explaining what we mean when we talk about necropolitics?
Necropolitics is the use of social and political power to dictate how some people may live and how some must die.
Well, yeah, and I think there's different people would have different answers. So I think for the sake of our discussion, one way for us to think about it is if you think about kind of another phrase from Foucault, biopolitics, that idea just refers to this way that nation states or governments or ruling classes sort of manage life and death in terms of populations and at the scale of nation states. And so when we turn it to necropolitics, we kind of import another side of this biopolitical management of people, which is to say, if you import some histories of imperialism and colonialism and racism and state terrorism, you start to see that there's kind of a necropolitical history in terms of how not only the life of populations have been managed over time and in different places, but also how like the death of populations have been managed and
it's death
and
politics.
Structured and organized.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so maybe it's the largest way to think about that is I think once you're talking about the extermination of indigenous peoples in North Central and South America, or the Jews and other populations of Eastern Europe in the mid-20th century, once you're at that scale, to me, you're dealing with kind of obvious examples of the necropolitical. But I think one other way to think about it is to sort of go in from there, go in from the legacies of imperial genocide and slavery and, you know, wartime concentration camps and genocides, and to sort of take those histories and institutions and powers as reference points or framing devices for understanding sort of maybe even everyday political economy. Because I think once you do that, once you kind of look through the screen or the lens of racial capitalism and think about the political economy and how it intersects with biopolitics and necropolitics, you get a different way to understand events and crises and why, you know, certain kinds of patterns of population death are allowed to continue. So, you know, like something like the opioid crisis, or something like mass shootings, or something like the prison system, et cetera.
Yeah, well, I mean, mass shootings are certainly, you know, a topic of public discourse right now, as, you know, another high school shooting in Parkland, Florida, with you know, the reaction to it has been kind of incredible from the high school students themselves, and the NRA getting really defensive.
They use their media to assassinate real news. They use their schools to teach children that their president is another Hitler. They use their movie stars and singers and comedy shows and award shows to repeat their narrative over and over again. And then they use their ex-president to endorse the resistance, all to make them march, make them protest, make them scream racism and sexism and xenophobia and homophobia, to smash windows, burn cars, shut down interstates and airports, bully and terrorize the law-abiding, until the only option left is for the police to do their jobs and stop the madness. And when that happens, they'll use it as an excuse for their outrage. The only way we stop this, the only way we save our country and our freedom, is to fight this violence of lies with the clenched fist of truth. I'm the National Rifle Association of America, and I'm freedom's safest place.
And so there's, you know, once again we have this conversation, but it's not a new conversation. I mean, I feel like, you know, and this is what I kind of wanted to focus in on today a little bit was, you know, you and I came of age in the 90s when this kind of like white male violence was all over the place. And I mean, there are multiple examples, and I know they're all, you know, slightly different, but we had, you know, the Oklahoma City bombing, the Atlanta Olympics bombing, the Unabomber himself, and Ted Kaczynski, who was ultimately caught in, like, I think the late 90s. And then, you know, Columbine itself happening in 1999.
Just Sheriff's Office, do you have an emergency? Yes, I am a teacher at Columbine High School. There is a student here with a gun.
Okay, has anybody been injured, ma'am?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and the school is in a panic, and I'm in the library. I've got students down under the table, kids.
Which, for younger listeners who don't understand, you know, that these kinds of mass shootings were not commonplace in America. You know, the Columbine shooting was, you know, it was the top story, like the top story in the New York Times, something like 20 days after the shooting, because it was so shocking to Americans. Nothing like it had ever really happened before.
So there was like Eric on my right, and then Dylan was up on my left. And I looked up at Dylan and I said, "Hey, Dylan," and he said, "Hey, man." And I said, "What are you doing?" And it still like chills me how he was just like killing people.
There had been massacres, but not with two high school kids doing it in a suburban high school. And so, you know, that element of class and that kind of like attention coming to violence because of, you know, who's getting hit by it is an element of this too. But either way, that idea was big for us in the 90s. This idea of like white male violence. And it's just and it's just grown into an everyday occurrence now. But what are we supposed to do with that? Because it feels like, you know, when Bowling for Columbine, you remember when Michael Moore put that movie out, and
that's right.
That movie, you know, his thesis, if I recall, was basically that violence in America, was endemic to the American character from the beginning, from the country's founding, but also that he kind of had a theory that violence was like trickling down from the state.
Do you know that the day that Columbine happened, the United States dropped more bombs on Kosovo than any other time during that war?
I do know that, and I think that that's really ironic, that nobody said, well, maybe the president had an influence on this violent behavior. No, because that's not the way the media wants to take it and spin and turn it into fear, because then you're watching television, you're watching the news, you're being pumped full of fear. There's floods, there's AIDS, there's murder, cut to commercial. Buy the Acura, buy the Colgate. If you have bad breath, they're not going to talk to you. If you got pimples, the girl's not going to fuck you. And it's just it's a campaign of fear and consumption.
But what are we supposed to make of some of those ideas? I know that you've played with some of those.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of truth in that, and I think that there's so many different directions to take it in. And I think one, obvious thing to point out is there's a way to look at the kind of history or the economy of active shooters and mass shootings through the lens of political economy or through the lens of class, and also gender, that kind of breaks out of the discourse a little bit that we see in the news, even in the wake of things like the most recent horrific shooting in Parkland. And one way to think about that is to remind ourselves that the active shooter demographic shares a lot in common with the serial killer demographic, which is, as you rightly point out, typically almost exclusively male, and typically, though not exclusively, white male, although you could make certain kinds of claims about the kind of racial identification of the killers. And one thing that I think is kind of interesting to note is that the effects of the killings taken together, if you look at who's dying, including lots of children, but also lots of women and young women. The effects of the violence are essentially fascist, which is to say, if you understand fascism as kind of a race-based and gender-based form of political violence, the victims overwhelmingly, again and again and again in these massacres, are working class and middle class people and kids, a lot of whom are women and girls.
Yeah.
And if you look at the recent victims of the Parkland shooting, you can see that these killers are going after men and women, but in some ways, because the victims are kind of stretching across, working and middle class backgrounds and both forms of gender, when you apply this to something like Columbine or even the nightclub shooting in Florida that was at that kind of like queer dance hall,
yes,
you start to see that the main political structure that's being upheld here, the kind of implicit ideology, is racial fascism, gender-based fascism.
And a kind of patriarchal violence, a kind of reinforcing, like in a very very violent public way, a reinforcing of like dominant patriarchal ideas, and ideas about dominance. But like, it's hard. It's funny to read this stuff as political, because in general, I think many people are kind of reading this stuff, these shootings as just, explosions of male rage, but not really contextualizing that and seeing it as, it's not ISIS, but it kind of is at the same time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and one thing I think that one way to politicize this is to kind of try to explain that the very fact that it doesn't come with a terrorist message, and the very fact that it doesn't seem obviously political in the way that like an ISIS attack would, is actually the sign of its politics and actually points to something that our society, particularly the liberal media, for lack of a better word, and the conservative media,
easy, Alex Jones,
has a hard time imagining. Which is the imagination of class warfare. Another important thing to point out is that the agents doing the killing themselves are overwhelmingly lower and middle class men. Like, they're not always super rich men, although you could make a case that some of them, had a lot of money, like the guy in Vegas. But it's another way to say that, like, isn't it interesting that the demographic of the class that's producing these male killers, that they overwhelmingly come from the classes who are fascism, which is to say the stormtroopers of fascism historically, and this is like according to basic histories of Nazi Germany, but also like Trotsky's analysis, his original analysis of what is fascism, is that it's a petite bourgeoisie phenomenon. It's a lower middle class phenomenon. It's the men who are, overwhelmingly concerned with losing their status to immigrants or to minorities or racial groups that they feel themselves historically superior to. It's these groups of men who come from kind of a race-based, superior kind of psychological group, like white men, who are themselves kind of the most at risk to become the people performing this kind of violence. And so, again, it would take me back to this idea about class warfare, and to think by saying, okay, if this is about a kind of structure of fascist violence that's occurring and reoccurring, in part because we're not analyzing it as fascist violence, we're analyzing it as through the lens of mental illness and individual psychology, when we could be analyzing this through the lens of political economy. I think one thing that helps us to understand, though, if we kind of break through that wall and just even take this up for consideration, however insane it might sound to some people, I think once we do that, we start to see, in some ways, why the state is ineffective at controlling this violence, and how, in some ways, it's like you have to say things that no one will say because you're not allowed to say them.
Shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tits.
For instance, that the kind of introduction and toleration of things like drugs and guns into the population actually performs important political benefits for the stability of the ruling order and neoliberalism in general, and the sort of racial capitalism that structures the United States in particular. So, for example, if you introduce drugs into a population, you will give people the mechanism to destroy themselves or to divide themselves. And the same is true with guns. So that, what guns do politically is that they turn the population against itself. And you can see that now with the Parkdale students going after people like Rubio and the GOP and the NRA.
Yeah.
But what's the practical effect of this? Well, it's business as usual. So just like the party system is paralyzed between Democrats and Republicans in this razor-thin Congress, this is also true of the situation we're describing now, in which the population is against itself. And this goes back to the fact that, I think one of the overwhelming ways to understand the United States isn't just as this kind of imperial aggressor who is the product and remains an agent of settler colonialism on the continent of North America, and is this kind of agent of repression and genocide against populations that it perceives external to it. But this is also a nation state, a settler society, that went to war against itself over the terms of its own racial capitalism in the mid-19th century.
Yeah.
And so this kind of sets in line a sort of cultural, political DNA in which kind of civil conflict, civil strife, and civil violence are the defining features of the population, and that this is actually productive, because as long as you have a population that's kind of this diverse and antagonizing itself, that population cannot organize to do other things. So that, we're in this weird crisis of democracy where not only can you focus on one scandal from the next coming out of the Trump White House or what have you, but any population that has to be obsessed with its own safety of its children and its neighbors, and the fact that we have to be terrorized by these shootings. If you're living in a state of fear, and you're living in a state of fear of guns, but also not only mass shootings, but also your neighbor who has the gun and doesn't want to give it up, and in some ways you kind of believe that person is fantasizing about, killing you and wishing you were gone.
Yeah.
When you live in a society like that, there is no way you're going to produce solidarity across communities, and there's no way that you're going to
I don't even know how you produce a society. After all, I mean, honestly, the psychological impact of having an entire society that's kind of fearing that they're going to be shot at any moment in public, whether that's true or not, I think the statistics don't. I mean, the statistics still, I think, are that these shootings are rare, in some respects, but at the same time, your chances of getting shot are low, you're more likely to die because you don't have health insurance in America. You know, like that's kind of the reality of another necropolitics, I guess. But either way, the fear of being shot is certainly pervasive in the culture, and like that idea is the one that like basically gives everyone a form of PTSD at all moments. We know that soldiers who are exposed to to gunfire and bombs going off for a certain period of time. After a certain period of time, your mind begins to shatter. And when you have the entire population of the United States living in a constant state of fear of violence being perpetrated in public places, I think the effect is staggering. And the other thing that I wanted to say in response to what you just put out is that that these shootings have they've become in this particular instance, the latest high school shooting in Parkland, Florida, the high school students have become targets of the alt-right and targets of what we would call this kind of angry rising fascist voice that for whatever reason, like the mainstream media outlets like the New York Times are amplifying again and again and again. But this like fascist neo-white supremacist voice is now targeting the students, and you wonder, like, will violence, more of these instances of violence become even more openly political? And does it feel like to you? And I know that some people laugh at these ideas, and I think they basically I think they come through. I mean, this idea, I think, courses through both the extreme right and the extreme left, but I want to be clear about what we're saying. But it feels like, that the idea of civil war is on the lips of many people as we come to this idea of, I don't know, I'm thinking about the first instances of violence along the border territories that were the opening acts of the Civil War, really, and the stuff with John Brown, etc. Does it feel like that to you? Does it feel like a civil war is brewing in America? How do we frame that?
I think it's kind of like a Black Mirror civil war is already happening. One of the things that you've often said in the past and we've talked about is when we talk about like the coming war, like the coming war with China,
right?
It's already here in some ways. And if you've been living in the global South, if you were in the Vietnam War, paying attention to it, or if you were Vietnamese, or if you've been living in El Salvador, Guatemala, or Honduras, or Colombia, or any range of states, kind of, and what we think of as the global South, you've been living through a world war for the past 40 years. That's been like hot and cold at various moments. But imagine who all is living under dictatorships now, and think about all the people who have lived under violent dictatorships in places like Brazil or Argentina in the last 30, 40 years, places like, Indonesia, even South Korea. So once you go back 40 years, you're looking at civil populations that have been experiencing violence and torture and police regimes, in kind of a chronic fashion, and that those sort of, right-wing groups, paramilitaries, but also dictatorships and governments that have been, overseeing populations in places like Chile or Colombia or Nicaragua. When you think about all that violence, to me, that's all civil war style violence. And you look at places like, Nicaragua or El Salvador that are having these internal conflicts. So you look at Colombia and how it's trying to emerge from a civil war pattern. I think you take the Black Mirror and you apply that to the United States, and in the same way that people say, well, the South kind of won the Civil War if you just go out of a couple decades, that the North won the military war, but it's hard to see how the South lost the war of ideas, at least until the 1960s. And so when you think that, well, in what ways does the shootings today and the groups that are advocating a sort of, militant armed status and that want access to weapons, in part because it's a constitutional right, and maybe it is, that's not a battle that I would want to fight legally or rhetorically right now, but the larger overall political point that I'm trying to make is I don't think the Civil War ever ended. And I think once you sort of admit that, we're not going to see a civil war kind of start in which you have organized military campaigns, ongoing, but we should all try to understand that are kind of experienced in the United States, and this is true for indigenous people, native peoples, people of color. This has been true for 40 years. We've been living in a state of civil war, but it's kind of a low intensity war for several decades, because to me, if you even look at the rise of the incarceration system, the mass incarceration since about 1980 till about now, David, well, Jesus Christ, shouldn't we start to associate those prisons, these camps, with this warehousing of human bodies, these regimes of punishment, torture, sexual abuse, these militant institutions? Shouldn't we start to associate those with institutions of a kind of civil conflict that's ongoing, but that we're taught to have a criminal justice discourse way of talking about these things, or we're given a different language to talk about these things in a way that actually doesn't do justice to the experience and the reality of them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and you know what it makes me think of? I'm sitting here looking at my bookshelf at this book that I can't recommend highly enough, called Blood in the Water, by Heather Ann Thompson. That's about the Attica uprising.
Attica! Attica!
And ultimate massacre of the prisoners at Attica in 1970. That 1971. That instance of what happened at Attica kind of resonates strongly with what you're just saying in terms of this idea that those prisoners at Attica were rising up for against incredible human rights violations, and many of them were in there basically for multiple parole violations. They were just like a bunch of, honestly, it was a bunch of mostly, of course, disproportionately black and Latino kids that were pulled from the city of New York. And I'm not going to get into the whole story, but that story ends with a massacre that's unbelievable in its scale and its violence that the police perpetrated against the prisoners, the striking prisoners, and they killed the hostages too. But then they circulated a lie within the media.
Initial reports by state officials that the hostages had died of slashed throats were refuted by the medical examiner.
The first 8 autopsies were on the cases identified to us as hostages. All 8 cases died of gunshot wounds.
The medical examiner's finding was significant. The inmates had no firearms. Gunfire by state troopers and prison guards was responsible for all the deaths during the retaking of the prison.
And they were covering it up. But the point is that, you were talking
Talk about a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, and that, Governor Rockefeller was a big part of, promoting that idea, and certainly the idea of justifying the police violence.
Armed rebellion of the type we have faced threatens the destruction of our free society. We cannot permit that destruction to happen.
And we've seen in the decades since this kind of normalization of police violence and militarized police, etc., but also kind of, I don't know, an ideological push to make the cops be the good guys too in the public. So I was thinking about that in terms of this kind of discourse that we have about prisons. To us, we see them as, I think, when you read about mass incarceration in the United States, you think about concentration camps. I think about Indian massacres. I think about the whole history of authoritarianism and violence in this country, certainly racialized violence.
Right.
But you have to understand that most Americans don't see it that way. Most Americans see prisons and police as like 100% natural parts of the political order in this country.
Yeah, well, I guess I would say many Americans, me and you, we always go back and forth in that language of who are the Americans that we're describing, and who counts in that idea. And so, true. But I take your point. I fully take your point. And one thing that I think, if you accept that the war, like the opioid crisis, is in part like a war on a population, that it's tied into the healthcare system in all kinds of ways, or that even the healthcare system itself is tied into sort of a population warfare, or like the necropolitics of American healthcare would probably make sense to a lot of people, just even at the level of pre-existing conditions and denying them or instituting them or taking them away. This idea that we're going to live and let die, even amongst ourselves, mostly on the basis of access to resources. And I think that when you draw this back into like patterns of colonial and imperial and indigenous violence on the continent, you can see its continuity into the present. One book that I have been kind of reading and thinking through lately is the Dawn Pally, P-A-L-E-Y, Pally book, Drug War Capitalism. And she has an idea in there as she looks at the sort of recent history of narco-violence in Mexico and Colombia and other locations. She has this idea of La Guerra de los Pueblos, which is this idea of the war against people. And for her and others in the book, the language of the drug war is part of this kind of deception that you're describing, where at Attica they have this kind of cover story or a big lie that kind of papers over state-based terrorism, state-based violence. And what she calls La Guerra de los Pueblos, of this war against the people, is actually the way to understand what's happening to low-income people, but also indigenous people in Mexico, in Colombia, which we understand to be a war on drugs.
Yeah.
But in fact is this kind of, it's a kind of a neoliberal war for public resources and for natural resources. And both her and Peter Dale Scott in like books like Drug, Oil, and War kind of make this connection that the U.S. government has been using other countries' governments like Colombia in this kind of global war on drugs as these kind of proxy paramilitary or military forms of violence against people. But it's really in part about land appropriation and access to oil resources and petroleum.
I drink your milkshake. I drink it up.
But one of the reasons why I think that's so interesting is that it's a way to think through not just the kind of global politics of kind of conspiratorial violence or something like this, which has been ongoing as part of the project of settler colonialism, since 1492. But it's also kind of gets back to this idea of like the black mirror of the Civil War, which is like, it's not that anyone's being told to do or create acts of violence. It's more that when you interject into a system all this instability and the mechanisms and tools by which people can destroy each other, you kind of give people the opportunity to do it. So, for example, it's like, no one told Kurt Cobain, to kill himself, but you put a gun in his hand and you kind of surround him with drugs. And sort of, there's a way that people as autonomous actors are nonetheless also these kind of really specific nodal points of intense forms of social structures and political economy. And, another way to see that is going back to, I love kind of teaching this song, but, Tupac's, mid-90s, I don't know what you'd call it, kind of like epic ballad changes. His, this kind of incredible rap song by Tupac. And one of the reasons I love this song is that it explains in very simple language this kind of La Guerra de los Pueblos, this idea that the drug war is really this kind of war on the black and brown community. And one of the lines in that song, I think, kind of spells out really simply actually what we're talking about. He says, give the crack to the kids.
Who the hell cares? One less hungry mouth on the welfare. First ship them, don't let them deal with brothers. Give them guns, step back,
watch them kill each other. And I think that idea where Tupac says, give them guns, step back, watch them kill each other, to me, that's Columbine.
Yeah.
To me, that's Parkland. For me, that is the way that you understand that you can create you disrupt a population and sort of introduce a kind of necropolitical management of people without actually having to be conspiratorial about it. That, you're willing to tolerate the death you're willing to have a kind of vampiric relationship to people's lives. And I like the fact that there's just two more kind of ways that I feel like Tupac has a way in on this. And the first way is later in that song, he says, and still I see no
changes. Can a brother get a little peace? It's war on the streets and a war in the Middle East. Instead of war on poverty, they got a war on drugs so the police can bother me.
And I think that what makes that so powerful too is that Tupac kind of goes global. It's kind of amazing that he's singing about the war in the Middle East, like the first Iraq war. And like, here we are 2 or 3 decades later and it's still going on. But this idea that the war on the streets and the war in the Middle East are already linked in the mind of urban black communities and like kind of, for lack of a better word, like black radical artists like Tupac in the mid-90s, so that people have been making these connections for decades. I just don't think that people have been I think maybe we're listening to them in a different kind of way.
Yeah, and I love that you brought up Kurt Cobain and Tupac, because those two figures, are they have a weird kind of, I don't know, there's a weird kind of symmetry to these two guys, and they kind of connect to this kind of wider intersection of politics and psychology. But it's like Tupac.
Mm-hmm.
They're both men. They're both men with guns in their hands who died by by gun violence. And
also surrounded by drugs.
Yeah, right. And the drug thing is there too. But also, it seems like they're both in their art. Both of these dudes were exploring, kind of this political moment and the kind of place that each of their groups signified within it. So like Tupac is talking from the perspective of like, I don't know, the black radical story and where it is, because Tupac is, his family is a part of the black radical movement of the 1960s and 1970s. So he's like kind of intimately connected to it, and so I think of him as the guy that's kind of documenting the movement and the state of the movement and where it's at. And you're right, connecting the kind of drug and gang violence that's kind of tearing black communities apart in the cities of the United States, connecting that to the violence in the Middle East. I mean, that stuff's brilliant. But then Kurt Cobain and Nirvana. He's not talking about stuff like that. Like Nirvana, I feel like more like was exploring the kind of dark psychology of the white male. Cobain, his work was a lot about gender, and his work was a lot about kind of poison and the kind of poison society. I mean, a lot of his songs were about rape and about male violence that were not really talking about political violence, but I guess not explicitly political. But I think what we're both saying is that the ideology is right underneath the surface, right, of these guys.
I agree, and also I think that if we're going to call these active shooters political agents of violence, even if they're not themselves articulating a coherent political ideology, I mean, I think that the political violence that Cobain was talking about is gender-based political violence. That it's not that this patriarchal violence comes out of nowhere. This is actually part of the kind of embodied experience of racial capitalism. And Cobain is also, remember, coming from a kind of rural / suburban but heavily working class family that's kind of broken up. And as we know, that all the famous divorces that he sings about, especially on In Utero, that divorce isn't out of a social context. It's the divorce is linked to economy. There's a political economy of divorce. And not to make too much of it, but I read over and over the number one cause of divorce is finances. That people that marry. That's the reason people delay even getting married in the first place. That marriage itself is part of a political economy.
Yeah.
And I just think that there's a lot to think about with just Cobain and Tupac as enormously symbolic public figures that died around the same time, linked to guns and drugs. There's a lot to be looked at there, also in terms of their class politics and their race politics and their gender politics. But I think we should pull back a little bit, because when you think about like public sympathy and the way that Cobain's death was articulated versus the way Tupac's death was articulated, definitely now
consumed by the public in different ways, for sure.
Totally. And I think that I found it really interesting that people like Patrisse Cullors, who's like one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, and Roxane Gay have both kind of come out since Parkland and said that it's interesting to know the difference in the kind of larger public support for the Parkland students versus like people that are protesting the police violence in places like Ferguson and Baltimore.
Right.
And in like a recent interview with Time Magazine, Patrisse Cullors was talking about her new book, When They Call You a Terrorist. And she says something that I think is worth us all contemplating. She says, young white students have been able to be seen as victims, which they are, and heroes, which they also are. But we instead of seeing us as victims and heroes, we were seen as a group of people that were aimless, that didn't have a plan, that were too angry. We're not doing it right. So we can't help but recognize the ways in which different racial groups are treated differently when they stand up for their lives. And I think that you can sort of see, with Parkland and with Columbine, that when this kind of La Guerra de los Pueblos, when this war on the people extends its violence up through the middle class, that it becomes activated and politicized differently. And it actually becomes mediated differently than when the victims of political violence are people of color, or even when they're working class, and we could even think about someone like, Daniel Shaver. And so I think that's also part of this kind of black mirror of the Civil War. But I think also might be worth thinking about, and you can let me know if you want to go down this road, like, why is it that most people would say, well, clearly the students who are the victims of the active shooting are somehow different or more innocent or carry different symbolic weight than like unarmed black men and women shot by the police in like contested legal situations. Like, I assume that liberals have a different way to adjudicate that those two situations. But I was wondering if you wanted to think through a little bit, how actually the kind of victims of mass shootings and the victims of police violence are actually kind of interrelated.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the way to talk about that in part is to look at. I mean, you brought up Daniel Shaver, right? And for those that don't know, I mean, you might not know the name, but you might have seen the video, which is honestly, of all these videos, one of the more horrifying I've ever seen, and that's saying something because it's just been from Eric Garner to Trayvon Martin to Tamir Rice. There've been just so many wrenching stories. But the immediacy of this particular video, because of the clarity of it and the setting in the hotel room.
Stop right there! Stop! Stop! Get on the ground, both of you! Lay down on the ground! Lay down on the ground!
That video is of a young man. I think he's about in his early 30s, I think, or late 20s. And
I thought he was like kind of early 30s, father of two, married dude.
Yeah. What the media would call an ordinary person, and by that they mean like a white middle class looking, certainly passing for middle class. Married father. But anyway, he's begging for his life.
You do that again, we're shooting you. Do you understand? Please do not shoot me. Then listen to my instructions. I'm trying to just do what you don't talk. Listen.
This police officer is, playing a kind of sick game of Simon Says with him, where he's making him do all these things like put one hand behind your back, now put the other one behind your back, now put one on the ground, now crawl toward us.
Okay, young man, listen to my instructions and do not make a mistake. You are to keep your legs crossed. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. You are to put both of your hands palm down straight out in front of you. Push yourself up to a kneeling position. I said keep your legs crossed! I'm sorry. I didn't say this in conversation. Put your hair! Hands up in the air!
And from what I understand, Daniel Shaver was intoxicated. So he was like drunk while he's sitting there, like being screamed at by a cop in full military gear aiming an automatic rifle at him.
And he's also like furiously weeping and crying, saying, "I don't want to die."
Yeah, he's screaming, begging for anything to stop, and I don't want to die. And the cop just screaming at him, order after order, and ultimately the cop just opens fire on him and kills him right there in the hotel in front of his family.
Crawl towards me. Crawl towards me. Yes, sir. Don't talk.
It's a really horrifying thing, but again, it's like part of a larger pattern of police violence that we've seen captured on video and not captured on video again and again. And thinking about the Rodney King incident being the inciting incident of the LA riots in 1992 being like a beating. that has progressed in our lifetime to see, to develop into these kind of like, I live in a town in Southern California that doesn't experience much crime at all, and yet we have jackbooted stormtroopers with armored vehicles everywhere in this town. And that, when I think about that and connecting, that's what connects to me to the wider violence that we see coming from, the mentally ill or deranged people that are doing these mass shootings. However you want to explain the psychology of that, I'm kind of ultimately in a broad way, I'm with Michael Moore in the sense of like, we're a violent society. And not only are we a violent society, but we have a ton of automatic weapons available to people, or at least weapons of mass destruction readily available to people. And those things together are, a part of our historical legacy. And I feel like this is just the 21st century version of it. I mean, the psychology of the police and the police murdering people on the street is not that different from the psychology of a mass shooter. And to me, it's not that different from the psychology of, the Jeffrey Dahmers and the BTK serial killers that we heard about in the 90s. I mean, what's weird, I always kind of, it's a sick thing, and it connects a lot to maybe the conversation that I had with Claudia about Stephen King books. But, we have a legacy too, and I feel like they haven't been around. And I was the kind of kid in high school and middle school that was, I think my parents and older people were concerned about how much I like to read about serial killers. But we had this legacy in America of these weird, like these fucked up dudes like Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs.
Oh, wait. Was she a great big fat person?
Cut up women and keep them in the refrigerator. You're American psychos, that are basically doing some sort of weird thing at home, stacking up bodies, doing odd shit with them, making bedspreads and T-shirts out of human skin and all that kind of shit. So that legacy is there in America, but it's kind of gone away. And I feel like now our serial killers are happening in public. They do it all at once. They don't kill over years and do like a slow. Our rate of killing is accelerating, or the attention span of our serial killers has decreased, so they can't draw out these long, sick projects. Instead, they're just doing one massive outburst of violence in public. Either way, it's all connected to some sort of sick American psychology that's been there from the founding of the nation, I would say. You and I, Justin, read a book called Gunfighter Nation by Richard Slotkin. And do you remember reading that book in graduate school, or reading at least some of the ideas in it?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean that book. Yeah. That book kind of ties a lot of strands together. And I remember, it's kind of a book that made me think about the conquering of the West in particular, and that how the conquering of the West was, as you know, a genocide, but a genocide disguised as something else. And in our national mythology and the ideology that really Slotkin is really concerned with, like Western dime novels and ultimately Western movies. But it became popular culture became the way through which genocide and serial murder became stories of heroism. And stories of specifically male heroism, and tied to ideas of dominance of the continent, etc. So, in a lot of ways, I see the mass shootings and the mass incarceration and police violence, all of it very, very deeply connected to the history of this country, and something that we haven't reckoned with. And I haven't even, Justin, I won't even mention Vietnam, because I think you can already make that connection. But either way, that violence has been brought all the way up to 2018. And it's odd. It's to me, seeing the kind of outburst of political reaction from the high school students and the liberals who are supporting them calling for gun control is really, it's heartening in a sense of like, feeling like, that the kind of like faith in the democratic process is is there among young people, and they want to do something about it, and they're earnest about it. But at the same time, I can't help thinking about what you just said, which is that, you know, these mass shootings in some way, you know, benefit the what C. Wright Mills would call the power elite, but benefit the people and institutions that run this country. So
that's right.
Yeah, what do we do with that? I mean, can we say that the people are naive for expecting the government to do anything about this?
Well, no, but I don't know. There's a number of directions here. One, it's interesting just in passing to note that Slotkin himself connects the history of 19th century settler violence with Vietnam in some of that trilogy that you're referring to.
Yeah.
Second of all, I think understanding this as a product or a continuing product or a continuing reemergence of white settler violence is extremely important. That the kind of the settler indigenous violence that we associate with the 19th century that you're referring to is, you know, as important a framework for understanding contemporary 21st century political economies as violence as the institution of slavery, which we haven't gotten into, and which I think is kind of implicit behind some of the stuff that Patrisse Cullors was mentioning.
Yeah.
And I also think that it's not enough to say that it's kind of in the Michael Moore sense an American national problem or American national project, unless you're going to go the further step and say the founding fathers were all white men, and the nation was founded on white settler racism. And we have to understand the way that if you have if you're policing a class society, and I'm using that word on purpose because that's the title of a book by Sidney Herring that I think is relevant here.
Mm-hmm.
If you're policing a class society in the late 19th century and 20th century and 21st century in order to uphold a certain kind of class order in the C. Wright Mills sense of the word, then you have a new way to understand these connections between the fact that all these school shootings happen at public schools. They never really happen at private schools. You have a new way to understand that it's the exception that proves the rule when an active shooter attacks people in power, because they're really just attacking civilians. It's the same mindset of terrorism without the same intentional ideological political goal of terrorism. And so you have this idea that we're going to kill ordinary people, but they're all from the same population. You don't see people going into elite golf courses. You don't see people going into elite neighborhoods. You don't see people going into gated communities, private institutions. You don't see people going in large part into like big corporations like Google, Facebook. No one is aiming up with the violence, and because they're aiming in the middle,
they're punching down. Yeah. That's a really important point. I think. I mean, the only two examples. I mean, I can think of the ones that punched up, if you could call it that. And it's fucked up to even say that because they're killing people. But you know, with that set aside, we're a violent country, so we'll just deal with that. But Timothy McVeigh, you know, he attacked the FBI. And Christopher Dorner in Los Angeles, he was a veteran of the Iraq War and a LAPD officer, a decorated one as I understand it, and ultimately left the LAPD when he was a whistleblower for physical abuse of that other officers were that he witnessed. He was fired and ultimately waged war against his bosses and killed officers and killed a couple different figures in the LAPD. But those are the only two figures recently that I can think of that were doing like political violence that was aiming towards some structure of power rather than what you're describing as like kind of going after civilians in public places who are become just victims of what would be, you know, civilian terror.
That's right. If you take that. If you obsess over psychology, I think you miss these arguments and these kinds of claims and this kind of conversation, which we're not having, which is to say, look at the cumulative effects and the settings and the economy of these shootings and the kind of class politics, and you get a completely different way to analyze the situation, which is something that I think is just completely missing from liberal discourse about the NRA, about gun control, but also about mental health and mental illness, which even someone like Donald Trump can wander in because everyone's looking at input.
Yeah.
What is the input to the individual? What is the motive? And I think that it's a mistake to take violence that is obviously structural. And to keep trying to find individual motive, it's like you're trying to open a door with a crowbar, but there are better keys. There are better ways to unlock this door.
Yeah.
And I also think that if you look at the kind of archetype of Timothy McVeigh, who fits the demographic profile of so many active shooters and fits the demographic profile for the stormtroopers of fascism, historically, that I referred to earlier, you can start to see that there are psychological patterns or nodal points of systemic violence. And I think that is also a way to look at the Daniel Shaver execution. That is a way to look at the prevalence of killings of unarmed black men and women in places like St. Louis and Baltimore. That is a way to look at the targeting of certain individuals even in the rural areas of Colombia or the small towns of Mexico or the violence on the U.S. border, that there's this structural pattern to who's being killed and kind of what systemic structures are upheld and also are made profitable by this situation. And I think this is where, you know, if we wanted to kind of leave some threads for next time, we could. If you look at something like Angela Davis in Abolition Democracy, she would say, if she would first of all orient all these criminal justice forms of violence that are occurring against people of color with this institution of mass incarceration, that these are all kind of part of a similar set of processes and economy. And she would say a couple things right off the bat. She says that this punishment system, which is what she calls it, and I really like the fact that she emphasizes that this is about punishment, because I think this gets into some of the psychology behind Shaver and everything else, which is about a kind of quotidian sadism that's actually animating the violence, in which just like another deceptive language, the deceptive language is the person is a threat. But what the act of shooting exposes about some forms of police violence is the police use a language of self-defense to cover for the fact that these are serial killings that are actually expressions of sadism. And I think that that's clear if you look at the pattern of lynchings in which, there's a rhetorical move to link the lynching victim with rape and other forms of kind of social crime against the white community. But in fact, the lynching itself is often attended by families and is a site of festivities and ritual. Orlando Patterson writes about this really, really well in his book, Rituals of Blood. And so what Angela Davis would come back and say is that the prison is kind of containing this architecture of racism that we see as the kind of trace of slavery. And what she also does, and this is kind of maybe fitting in with what you would possibly say about Vietnam, is that she actually explicitly links in Abolition Democracy the prison and military industrial complexes together. And she says both complexes earn profit while producing the means to maim and kill human beings and devour social resources. And so when you think about the public schools getting shot up, and when you think about the battle to integrate the public schools in the 1950s and 60s, and the battle to begin public schooling in the era of Reconstruction, and the battle to even have public schools in the first place in like the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, you realize that this public school is, even if it's a factory for liberalism, historically or otherwise, it's the site of attack, because if you are a fascist, the thing that you don't want are women learning. The thing that you don't want are girls becoming independent. The thing that you don't want are people of color becoming powerful, which is what these educational systems do. And if you are, that in some ways that it kind of explains the school as this site of like suicidal, homicidal violence.
Yeah, and I mean the alt-right or right wing has aimed its kind of hatred at college campuses mostly lately. Yeah, and seeing both the teachers and the students kind of join together in some sort of like criminal communist conspiracy, and they're really aimed at like dismantling those ideas because they feel threatened by them.
Of course. Well, and the thing is, the ideas literally are threatening. Even some of the more basic liberal ideas, like Michael Moore, otherwise, that me and you might kind of blow past in our desire to have like a caffeinated conversation like this.
Right.
They are threatening to the establishment of traditional white male settler society. Totally. They just are. And so the school is like, look at the school shootings as a symbolic site of violence in a culture that has yet to agree on not only the basic principles of its kind of national ideology, but a culture that is going through a contest over like the meaning of what it might mean to educate young women and girls, or to have an integrated, in a racially integrated society. Don't forget that these victims and these, even the spokespeople for the Parkland shooting, this is kind of an interesting, somewhat multicultural space here, if not explicitly so, and that this is the thing that's being attacked through violence. And you know, there's ways to think about Cruz within that context or not. But the thing that I would kind of want to leave a seed for is that when you go into someone like Orlando Patterson and Rituals of Blood, who really looks at the kind of ritualistic violence and lynching rituals and this idea of like Christian human sacrifice that sort of animates this extreme form of savage ritualized violence that spans like this 50, 60, 70-year period in American history, which I think might be an appropriate antecedent to some of what we're talking about now. Or Charles Reagan Wilson, his book, Baptized in Blood, which is also talking about like the religion of the lost cause, cultural nationalism, the restoration of a golden age, the idea that the sort of white South became a civil religion. If you go into their arguments, you start to see that there are like sadistic rituals around an economy of human sacrifice that structure and underpin like this larger political economy of violence we've been talking about, so that the way that it actually looks and gets expressed is that, you know, Cruz wants and desires to kill. Jeffrey Dahmer gets pleasure out of doing so. We think that's the kind of implicit way to understand what happened to Daniel Shaver and this like trigger-happy cop that executed him. So that there's this quotidian sadism that's also in the prison system. And, you know, one of the things that I found really remarkable to our present moment is there's a book called Other People's Blood by Robert Kahn.
Just going to hop in here and remind everybody of today's sponsor, Blood. Books about blood and just blood in general. Blood. Yum. Blood.
Where he talks about the hot gulag in the 1980s of the rise of immigration detention centers as the refugees came from El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala. And one of the things that you see happening...
Go ahead, sorry.
I'll just make this real point because I think it's connected to Angela Davis and other people we've been mentioning here, is that inside these immigrant prisons, we see torture, we see beatings, we see abuse, we see lies, we see coercion. In some cases, we see prison riots, you know, not quite on the Attica scale, but you see people fighting back, and you realize that there's this obnoxious disavowal of human rights that's happening sort of across the board. And when I Google all these immigration detention centers that he writes about, like a lot of them are still in operation, and some of them were built to warehouse children and other infants and young migrants. They're repeating
the horrors of slavery in those places today. And you know, my friend Carl Lindskog, who I went to the CUNY Graduate Center history department with, he has a book coming that I'm going to interview him very soon. That's about one of the nation's largest immigration detention centers in Florida. That is designed to house Haitian refugees. Kind of incredible stuff. But you know, it makes me think about, and I think you and I have hit on this idea probably in late night texts at some point, that, you know, the idea of that, like there's some national, like collective psychological need to have some space, and at this point it's occupied by prisons, but at another point in American history it was occupied by slavery, to like chew up people and to have this kind of like sadistic violence inflicted upon a portion of the population. And that sickness is contained within like law enforcement, and contained within the military, and contained within the prisons. But you know, we see it. You know, we see flashes of it bursting out of the population too. You know, the Parkland shooting is just one example.
That's right.
The Vegas shooting is another. But like, there's some like psychological need that we can barely contain, the need to kill each other, and we tell stories on top of it. Like, I'm struck by the idea that, you know, those Attica cops had to make up a story of goodness, of like saving people, to get over the fact that, or to communicate a story on top of what they really did, which was go in and just blow people to pieces with their weaponry, and basically have fun doing it. that the slavery had to have a story of paternalism laid over it. That we're doing something good here. You see it again and again that there's some sort of like big story that people put over really, really horrific and repeatable violence in American history that's really super disturbing. It almost seems to mean that like all the stories of American history and society, the entire kind of public discourse about what this nation is wrong. It's all a cover for a nation of people that are hell bent on tearing each other to pieces, and the state is kind of the biggest organizer of that violence.
Right, and that this state organized violence is symptomatic of what we would otherwise understand to be authoritarian capitalism, and a system that actually profits, just like in slavery, except that it's not chattel slavery as an institution that we're seeing anymore, but we're seeing traces and legacies of that continuing in something like mass incarceration or the war on drugs, which is a lie. That the war on drugs is not a war to save people from drugs. It's a regime and an economy of incarceration and policing that keeps a lot of people employed, including people who, in some cases, are from the communities that are, being broken up by the war on drugs, the so-called war on drugs. And so I think you also hit on this other key idea, which is people don't want to know this. This is the ideas that we talk about here, to the extent that people even find them plausible.
Yeah,
they're terrible things to contemplate.
Yes.
It's awful, and like it's the only thing I can say is like it's so traumatic to even read about something like Parkland.
And the
Ferguson.
only way to justify prison is by saying that all the people in there deserve it, and it's just part of keeping what society is. I mean, that's part of, I think, what is so mind blowing about Angela Davis's work about prison abolition is just how much she reveals how deeply the idea of incarceration and punishment has been ingrained in the American psyche, to the point where no one can even imagine a world where there isn't where there aren't massive cages with millions of people in them living solitary lives in which violence is inflicted upon them day to day. That's just like a regular part. That has to become the terms with if this society is ever going to move beyond the violence that we see. I am appreciative of the efforts that people are making towards gun control. I think the gun control lobby is incredibly, or the gun lobby and NRA are on the defensive right now, but at the same time they're incredibly powerful, and it's really addressing one part of a really, really complicated, multi-pronged problem.
I agree, and it's this idea that you mentioned of punishment, the idea that Angela Davis raises and exposes as punishment. Look at the desire, the negative ecstasy that's associated with the erotics of punishment. Why do these things so often turn into sexualized forms of violence against prison inmates, or even people that have been detained by the police?
Yeah.
And in what ways is this inscribed through regimes of gender and toxic masculinity? And in what ways are these connected to these powerful legacies historically, like slavery and indigenous genocide? Because I think if you start to connect these things together, then all of a sudden that kind of punishment regime where you have individuals inflicting this sadistic violence on other people, that is a commonality behind the shooter of Parkland students. That is a commonality. Almost obviously behind the guy that executed Daniel Shaver. That is this commonality between the regimes of torture that we saw in Abu Ghraib. That there is a structural thing. There is a structual
the soldiers at My Lai, the soldiers that did the My Lai massacre, and Lieutenant Calley and the others that did that. Yeah.
The outbreaks of violence, they don't look so random anymore. In fact, you can depend on them.
You can depend on them.
And I think that, and I think we have to have this discussion, as horrific as it is. I mean, we're dealing literally with horror. This is not that far removed from the Stephen King conversation you and Claudia had last year. We're dealing with stuff that's gross. It's disgusting. We'd rather not think about it. These are things that we purposely forget culturally. These are things we don't teach. These are things that almost don't belong to academic disciplines. Of course they do. But these are very, very, very difficult kinds of ideas to put into the public sphere. And unfortunately, it's that kind of collective psychology of denial that inhibits having a larger conversation, because until we can talk about gender, until we can talk about sadism, until we can talk about war, then I don't know that this stuff is going to end. Like, until we can start thinking about, queer feminisms, until we can start talking about like queer of color critique, until we can start thinking about
prison
sexuality and gender and race in different kinds of ways, I don't know what you expect from the rest of this.
Yeah, no, I know, and that's what's horrifying is that, Claudia and I have sat down many times. I mean, and when we have these conversations, it always ends on, well, we're kind of in the moment where we're just waiting for another massacre to happen at any moment. And that idea is really, really scary. And what we've seen is that, it's part of a continuity of violence, and that transforms, that takes different forms over different eras of American history, but it's always there. So I think we can always expect violence of some form. And I don't know if these, no one knows if these kinds of massacres will continue. But either way, I think more Americans should understand that these at this point over the last several years, the United States has had more mass shootings than Iraq. Which is a place that, certainly in the American psyche, is a war-torn Middle Eastern nation. People would probably describe it the way Trump does, as a shithole, right? But America the United States is experiencing massive violence on a scale that's larger than that. So I think that context is important, and to understand that we are in a crisis, but that it's part of a much wider set of circumstances that have been part of American history from the very beginning, and we're experiencing the kind of 2018 Trump era Black Mirror of violence in American life, and that's just what we'll have to live with. And the kind of political action that we're seeing and people that are looking for a solution. Again, I appreciate that. I think it's important, but at the same time, it has to be a process that for me, in order to stick, is going to require a larger reckoning with this country's history, and with the state of things now, the incredible injustices and violences and sadisms that are. I like your quotidian sadism, idea that it's not the spectacular Columbine or Parkland shooting, although those capture media attention. The everyday violence that is part of the normal operations of this country go unnoticed and don't have big political rallies and hashtags connected to them, but they are 100% a part of what's happening, and we're going to have to address them and turn our eye on it at some point. I don't know if that requires, making the media turn their eye on it, or creating hashtag movements or whatever. I'm not in that business. But it's certainly something that I think that the American people need to start paying attention to if we're going to overcome this stuff.
If I had to make my final point, I would second that, and I would just say that when you think about changing the question from why did he kill all those people to who allows him to kill, who else might want you dead by tolerating these ongoing deaths.
Yeah.
You start to understand political economy, and also the political economy of violence, and also who the other actors are. That this is not necessarily all random accidents. That because it's structural and it's allowed to occur, that this is just one more swirling regime of violence against a population that happens to be in some ways more privileged and visible and politicized, but that unless these other forms of violence are exposed and connected to it, and unless people realize that it's not just one sick individual that's able to account for this repetition of tragedy, that in fact there are regimes who tolerate this because in some ways they don't care, or they profit or benefit from it, that until the attacks are made against all the actors involved, and until even certain people are exposed for tolerating or promoting this continued repetition of tragedy, I don't know how successful we can expect to be, and to make those kinds of attacks it's very, very ugly and potentially confrontational. And so I don't have any illusions myself. And, as we said earlier in the show, I mean, I end this conversation in my own continued state of fear.
Another hopeful ending from Justin. Jesus. See you next time. If you haven't opened your veins into a lukewarm bath, please follow us on all the useless social media platforms and donate some of your about-to-be worthless money at www.patreon.com/nostalgiatrap.